Hello. Welcome to the 1980s. I'm wearing my 1980s shirt. It's actually, you've seen this shirt before. This is my father's shirt. I get hand-me-downs from my dad. Gives me nice shirts, which is good. This shirt, when he gave it to me, I was like, it's so 1980s. And it's 1980s, very specific. The movie Wall Street, with what's his name, Michael Douglas, very famous role for Michael Douglas. He's a little too old for you guys now. Greed is Good. It was all about Gordon Gekko, this Wall Street investor. I actually never saw him. And his whole mantra, his whole thing was greed is good. Very 1980s. You can also see the exact same shirt in the movie Office Space, which I think was from the 90s, made by the people who made South Park, I believe. It's a comedy about working in offices. Anyways, Greed is Good, the 1980s. Boy, the 1980s are very much defined by Ronald Reagan and his vice president, George Bush, the first George Bush, Papa Bush, who served 12 years in office combined. Some eras, as we've looked through U.S. history, are not the president. The Reagan-Bush years are the Reagan-Bush years. They're really defined by them. What happens? Why is this? Two big things. There are when you talk about politics in the United States, there are domestic politics, so those are the things that take place within the country, and foreign politics, things that take place outside the country. They affect each other, of course. They're not completely separate, but within both domestic policies and in foreign policies, these were pretty dramatic changes that happened in the 1980s. Let's start in the domestic policies, shall we? Domestic policies. Reagan. So the 70s are the year of everything doesn't work. We don't believe in the government anymore. The Vietnam War was a mess. Watergate was a mess. 3 Mile Island, which was 1979. It's a nuclear power plant that had an accident and scared a lot of people. It's in Pennsylvania. Luckily, it was not as bad as other nuclear power accidents that would come later, but it was the first one that was publicly known and announced and everyone that what's going on. 70s are the hostages. Reagan shows up as soon as he is inaugurated in 1981. The hostages are freed because he had to deal with the hostage takers. It's a new dawn in America. Everything's going to be different. He promised hope. He was like, we are the city in the hill. We are the shining city of the hill. We're America. We're great. And Ronald Reagan had been a movie actor in the 1950s. He was most famous for being in the Bonzo movies, in which he would co-star with the chimpanzee. That's the person who became the president of the United States, an actor who performed with a chimpanzee. But everyone was kind of in the mood for, not everyone, but enough people that they elected him twice. Second time, in a landslide. He won big in 1984. He won. Everyone was just like, keep on going. One of the reasons the recession comes to an end, the recession, as we know, boom and bust. The recession ends and the economy starts growing back up again into the 1980s. But he fundamentally changes the way we talk about the government and the federal government. He would constantly say the government is the problem. He would say the federal government needs to be smaller. We need to have a deregulation, which means that the government should not be in charge of telling businesses what to do. For example, if we're not going to come. The federal government does a lot of regulation. It tells the Food and Drug Administration says your food production plant needs to be cleaned this many times, and you cannot use these chemicals in your food production. Your airplanes need to be inspected this many times. All kinds of things. And Reagan represented a wing of the government said no. The federal government should not regulate things. We should trust businesses to do it themselves. At the same time, the tax cuts, the argument that taxes are a form of governmental abuse, and taxing the rich it stops us from getting jobs. What's interesting is the tax rate for rich people goes during World War II. It's huge, it's a giant number. Almost 90% of what you get above a certain number. So during the 1950s, when all those boomers, the baby boomers, are going to college for practically for free, it's because the rich were paying a lot of taxes. The rich were doing fine, but they weren't. But money was put into the system, and lots of deals are done. That gets cut by the 1980s. It gets seriously cut, and the idea is trickle down economics. You give money to the rich people by cutting their taxes, and they'll use it to buy things, or maybe start a factory, and then they'll use that to pay people. You buy a limousine. Somebody's got to wash your limousine for you. It is a theory of giving rich people money so that the poor people can get the scraps from the table. It did not work, other than giving rich people a whole lot of money. And in the 1980s, we can see historically, like right now, one of the big issues that is talked about is income inequality. Inequality meaning that there are certain people who have a lot of money, have most of the money in society, and the vast majority of society has very little bit money to share. The top 1% has 20% of the money in the country, and everyone else has to fight over the rest. This really starts to begin in the 1980s in a much more exaggerated way. I mean, there's always been rich people, there's always been poor people, there's always people been in the middle. But in the 1980s, we see those rich people go, whoa, and those poor people go, and it was really drastically, you could see it happening in the 1980s. Homelessness was becoming a very big issue in the 1980s because of cutbacks from money spent on, for example, homeless shelters. Mental health institutions got closed down that were supported for people who needed help like that. You could literally see it happening in the 1980s. Reagan's vice president is George Bush, and so Reagan serves 8 years, 2 terms, and then Bush serves another 2 years, and so this lasts until 1992, the Reagan-Bush years. Foreign policy-wise, the Cold War, which has been going on since after World War II, is in full force. Reagan is a Cold Warrior. He believes in the Cold War. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, because of course Star Wars is coming up by then. He likes using movie analogies because he's a former movie actor, and the Cold War in the 1980s is in 3 places. One, the nuclear arms race going through the roof. At this point, by the 1980s, the United States and the Soviet Union, and there are other countries by then that have nuclear weapons. Great Britain, France, China, Israel, by the 1980s. Maybe a few more. Everyone's got nuclear weapons. But the U.S., the United States, and Soviet Union have tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. At this point, they were able to say how many times they could destroy the world over. Like, well, the United States can destroy the world 100 times, but the Soviet Union can only destroy the world 97 times. So we're in the lead. That was huge. It was a big. Reagan was just like we're gonna spend them. And by 1989, Soviet Union falls. But talking about three places, the Cold War in the 1980s, nuclear arms race. Number two, Afghanistan. Afghanistan, which the United States is now at war in right now, the longest war in U.S. history, starts becoming an issue back in 1979. 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, installs a puppet government, and the people, of course, of Afghanistan rebel against this, as one does when you get invaded by a foreign country. And the United States comes to the help by supplying them with money and weapons. And including some of the people that they helped in the 1980s were a young man named Osama bin Laden, who would come back into American history 20 years later. So the Afghanistan war, and what's interesting, I sent you a link. One of the videos was like the Afghanistan as a Vietnam War. During the 1980s, people talked about Afghanistan as being Russia's Vietnam. Vietnam at this point is shorthand for, if you say that's another Vietnam, it means it's another long war that you're going to lose and you're going to suffer horribly. You know, people are going to die, and you're going to spend away a bunch of money, and it's for nothing. It's a waste of everything. In the 1980s, Afghanistan is Russia's Vietnam, and it drags them down. The third place that the Cold War really takes place, and Reagan is a big fan of this, is in Central America. Also in 1979, the Nicaraguan people overthrow their dictator, Anastasio Somoza. I'm so messing up his name. One of the reasons he was a dictator, and so people want to throw over dictators because they want to have democracy. They want to have control over their own country. One of the things that really broke the back of Somoza in the eyes of the people is that in 1972 there was an earthquake in Nicaragua, and the Somoza government stole the money that was supposed to be for the people. 1972, Nicaragua, it's also when Roberto Clemente, the very famous baseball player, died, flying to Nicaragua to deliver aid for the earthquake. So in 1979, Somoza gets overthrown by a group of revolutionaries, and they're like, we're starting up the new socialist Nicaragua. The United States supports the counter-revolutionaries, the Contras, as they're called, and but Congress is like, we don't want another Vietnam. At this point, Vietnam is like hanging on the country. We don't want another one of them. We don't want another long war that we're going to lose. And so no troops are ever, some troops are sent to Central America, but not massive amounts of troops like in Vietnam. But throughout Central America during the 1980s, there's a war in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Those four countries have big, bloody wars. The United States sends lots of military aid, dumps weapons in there, and doesn't do the fighting itself, lets others fight themselves. But those last throughout the 80s, and also involves the Iran-Contra affair, which is when the Reagan administration sells arms to Iran, and then uses the money to buy weapons for the guerrilla armies in Nicaragua. Oh God, another thing in the 1980s. Jeez, the 1980s were a lot was going on. Iran and Iraq go to war. The United States supports which country? Both countries. It supports Iran and Iraq, gives aid to both of them so that they fight each other and they can kill each other. This is when we're supporting Saddam Hussein. We're not going to really get to it. We'll talk about it, I think, in the next one. But in 1991 is the first Persian Gulf War, which the United States invades. Iraq invades Kuwait. There's a backstory there as well, of course. And the United States puts together a coalition, drives them out of Kuwait, but also sends troops to Saudi Arabia, which infuriates a young Osama bin Laden and a lot of others who do not want to see these foreign soldiers in the Holy Land. So boy, a lot is bubbling up in the 1980s that we are dealing with right now. Another thing I want to talk about the 1980s, the other videos I showed you. One, you got to watch Thriller by Michael Jackson. MTV is invented in the 1980s. 1981, that's when it all started. Music as videos started then. But the AIDS crisis. The AIDS crisis starts in the 1980s. Still with us today, to tell you the truth. It's much more manageable now. There are drugs that you can manage the disease. It's not cured. Never found a vaccine. Right now, we are living through a global pandemic, and one of the frustrating things for me is watching the leader of the free world. They didn't really call the President of the United States the leader of the free world before. Back in the 1980s, you were the leader of the free world because it was the Cold War, this side versus that side. But that's over. And so Donald Trump is not the leader of the free world. One of the frustrating things is watching his reaction to this global pandemic and just making lots of mistakes and tried to ignore it and tried to. However, during the AIDS epidemic, when that started, Ronald Reagan completely ignored it. He did not even mention the word for years. Years took. And the reason is that, as that little video I showed you, asked you to watch, showed you, when AIDS began, it was considered a gay disease. The gay rights, gays as being an equal part of society, was still a very new thing in the 1980s. The gay rights movement hadn't really started until 1970. 1969 is the Stonewall riots, which starts it in New York City. And the 1970s, these battles over whether gay people can be teachers, whether gay people can own property, whether they can be a part of society, and so in the 80s, it's when the disease gets attached to gay people, it's very easy for some people to say, we don't need to deal with that, it's not our problem, including the President of the United States, who completely ignored it and did nothing about it for years. Which prompted an organization to fight for people who have AIDS and looking for a cure, and it was called ACT UP, and they used civil disobedience again, using tactics from the civil rights movement. So there you go, the 1980s. I remember them like they were just 40 years ago. Oh my God, 40 years ago, the 1980s. All right. I'm going to type up the test now. And then next week we have from the 1990s until 2007, which is the year that most of you were born. And then we are done. And then that's it. All right. Oh my God, it's a long one today.